Somewhere around the 1960s, a very specific kind of knowledge quietly disappeared from British gardens, and almost nobody noticed it going. The Royal Horticultural Society had been running since 1804, producing journals and guides and flower shows for a century and a half. But the people actually growing food weren't learning from any of that. They learned by standing next to someone older and watching what they did. A hand position on a tool, the right moment to cut something back, when to water and when to leave it alone. None of it written down anywhere because nobody thought it needed to be. Then, central heating replaced open fires, chemical fertilizers arrived on garden center shelves, and the generation that had grown food out of wartime necessity handed their plots over to a generation that was being told it could simply buy what it needed. Most of that handover was fine, but 13 methods didn't make it across. That's what this is about. British gardeners used for generations, never explained, and eventually stopped passing on. They still work. We just forgot we knew them. Before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Old British gardeners read their plots before they did anything else, and the first thing they read was the weeds. Not as a metaphor, but as a genuine diagnostic tool, one that told an experienced gardener more about soil condition than any purchased testing kit. Dock and horsetail growing on a patch pointed to heavy, poorly drained acidic ground that would compact underfoot and hold water badly. Chickweed growing thickly in green told a different story. Fertile, nitrogen-rich soil in reasonably good condition that would likely grow well-fed crops without heavy amendment. Clover, spreading across a bed, signaled nitrogen shortage because clover fixes its own nitrogen through bacteria living in its roots and tends to establish itself precisely where that deficiency has reduced competition from other plants. Dense nettles in a corner were the mark of high nitrogen and phosphorus, the product of years of accumulated organic material breaking down in one place. An old gardener walking onto an unfamiliar plot did not look at the soil first. Those plants had been testing the conditions far longer than any gardener ever could, and their results were sitting right there on the surface for anyone who knew the vocabulary. The second thing old gardeners read was the calendar, but not the printed one. Britain's countryside runs on what ecologists now call phenological indicators, natural events that signal the arrival of conditions a date on a page cannot guarantee. The old saying was precise: cast ne'er a clout till May be out. Most people assume this refers to the month. It does not. May refers to the hawthorn tree, and the instruction was to avoid planting tender crops until hawthorn came into blossom, which happens anywhere from mid-April to late May, depending on latitude and the season. A gardener following that indicator was responding to actual conditions in the ground and air, not a date that could arrive in a cold year or a warm one, with equal indifference to what was actually happening underfoot. The elm leaf carried a similar instruction. When the elm leaf is as big as a mouse's ear, you can sow barley without fear. Dutch elm disease killed an estimated 25 million trees across Britain during the 1970s, and those elms are largely gone now, but the principle behind the saying remains entirely intact. Sow by what the season is actually doing, not by what the page says it should be doing. Like and subscribe now if you want the rest of these, because what is coming in the next chapters is the part that will genuinely surprise you. The single most counterintuitive practice passed across generations of British kitchen gardeners was the habit of dropping rusty nails or old iron scraps into the watering can and leaving them there through the growing season. Not superstition, not decoration, and not accidental. Iron leaches slowly from rusting metal into water, and what results is a weak solution of chelated iron that plants experiencing iron deficiency can absorb directly through their roots. That deficiency shows up as yellowing between the leaf veins on younger growth, while the veins themselves stay green, and it turns up most often in alkaline soils where iron exists in the ground but sits locked in a form roots cannot access. Old British gardeners did not have the chemistry to explain the mechanism. What they had was the observation that certain plants responded when watered from a can that had been sitting with old nails in it, and that observation was consistent enough across enough households to establish a practice that persisted for generations. The method worked because the observation was accurate and no further explanation was required. Cooled water from boiling vegetables, and potatoes especially, went directly onto the garden rather than down the sink, carrying starch and small amounts of potassium with it. Used tea leaves went straight around plants in the garden rather than into a separate bin, scattered most often around roses and acid-preferring plants, where their slight acidity and trace nutrients were considered worth having over the long term. In a household running on coal fires and producing large quantities of tea every single day, the leaves were a consistent byproduct with an obvious destination, and sending them to the garden was no more complicated a decision than sending vegetable peelings to the compost heap. The third practice that came from the same household logic is the one old gardeners used without discussion and almost never mentioned to anyone outside the immediate family: human urine, diluted at 10 parts water to 1 part urine, and applied to the soil rather than directly to plant leaves, delivers a balanced liquid feed at no cost and with no processing required. 1 liter of human urine contains approximately 11 grams of nitrogen, 1 gram of phosphorus, and 2.5 grams of potassium, which happen to be the 3 primary nutrients that most commercial fertilizers are built around, present in a form that becomes plant available once diluted and applied to living soil. A 2010 study found it as effective as commercial fertilizer for growing tomatoes. Old British gardeners who kept allotments through rationing and into the post-war years were not embarrassed by this. They had grown up in households where nothing that carried value got treated as waste, and the nitrogen cycle was something they understood through observation long before anyone handed them a scientific explanation for it. Epsom salts entered old British kitchen gardens long before any scientific explanation attached to them, and the explanation, when it came, confirmed precisely what observation had already established. Magnesium sulfate is what Epsom salts are, and magnesium sits at the center of every chlorophyll molecule in every green leaf, meaning a plant running short on it cannot photosynthesize efficiently. The visible result is yellowing between the leaf veins on older leaves while the veins themselves stay green, a pattern distinct from other deficiency symptoms and recognizable once you know what you are looking at. Old gardeners dissolved a tablespoon in water and applied it around the roots of tomatoes and roses, showing that specific yellowing, and the plants responded. The Royal Horticultural Society confirms that magnesium deficiency produces exactly that symptom and that Epsom salts address it, while noting that the treatment works when the problem genuinely is magnesium deficiency and does little when the yellowing has a different cause. The discipline required was to observe the pattern of yellowing before reaching for any solution, which is precisely the discipline old British gardeners applied to every problem they encountered in the garden. Aspirin dissolved in water before watering also appeared in British kitchen gardens, and the connection to plant science became clearer when researchers established that salicylic acid, which is chemically related to aspirin, triggers a plant's immune response and improves resistance to disease. Old gardeners, working from observation rather than mechanism, dissolved a tablet in their watering can, and in 2004, the United States Department of Agriculture research team confirmed that salicylic acid boosts plant immune responses, which made the old habit look considerably less eccentric than it had appeared to anyone who had not tried it. Chitting potatoes was a standard part of the growing year for old British gardeners, carried out in January and February as a fixed winter task, and it is one of the techniques most consistently dropped by modern gardeners who grow potatoes without understanding what they are actually waiting for. The method itself is straightforward. Place seed potatoes in egg boxes or shallow trays in a light, cool space, typically a spare bedroom windowsill, and allow short, sturdy sprouts to develop before planting out, starting about 6 weeks before the intended planting date. The Royal Horticultural Society recommends chitting specifically for first early and second early varieties, and a potato with established chits goes into the ground with a head start, producing growth and eventually harvest earlier than an unchitted tuber would manage. Old gardeners kept this as a fixed winter task, alongside turning the compost heap and cleaning the tools through the quiet months when nothing was yet growing. The sweet pea trench was another fixture of the serious British kitchen garden that has largely disappeared from practice without ever being formally abandoned. Competitive exhibitors and dedicated growers dug trenches 18 inches deep in autumn, filled the bottom with layers of newspaper, kitchen scraps, and manure, backfilled the trench, and left the whole thing to settle through winter. Sweet peas planted into that prepared ground in spring grew into plants whose roots had access to decomposed organic material placed below them months earlier. The National Sweet Pea Society, founded in 1900 and still active, emerged from a culture of competitive growing in which that level of autumn preparation was considered standard practice rather than exceptional effort. Old gardeners who grew sweet peas for exhibition understood that the flower on the plant in July was the visible result of decisions made the previous October, and they prepared accordingly. Mulching with newspaper was another practice carried directly from the make-do and mend culture of wartime Britain into post-war kitchen gardens and well beyond. Layers of wet newspaper placed on the soil surface and covered with a thin layer of compost or soil suppressed weeds and retained moisture through the growing season cost nothing beyond the paper itself, decomposed into the soil over time, and did the same work as mulches that people now purchase in bags at considerable expense. The principle is unchanged, the material is free, and the only difference now is that the paper goes into recycling rather than onto the garden, which means the garden loses and the recycling bin gains something it was never meant to hold. Old British gardening proverbs were not sentiment, and they were not superstition. They were compressed, practical instruction in a form that could be remembered without writing anything down and passed from one person to the next without a book, a course, or a printed guide. The most widely known of them covered sowing seeds in stations, one for the rook, one for the crow, one to die, and one to grow. Not pessimism about the garden, but an accurate accounting of the losses a gardener should expect in sowing into open ground in British conditions, producing a sowing quantity that matched the reality of germination rates and pest pressure. A gardener who sowed one seed per station and expected every seed to grow was a gardener who would find gaps in their rows and spend the rest of the season wondering what went wrong, and a gardener who sowed full understood what they were working with and planned for the outcome rather than being surprised by it. The instruction about parsley, that it should be sown on Good Friday, preserved a timing principle in a memorable form that required no understanding of soil temperature to follow correctly. Parsley is notoriously slow to germinate, often taking 2 to 5 weeks. Requires soil warm enough to support that slow process reliably. Good Friday falls anywhere from late March to late April, and for most of Britain, that range captures the point at which soil temperatures have risen consistently enough to give parsley a reasonable chance of germinating within a useful window. Planting beans on St. David's Day, the 1st of March, served a similar function in parts of Wales and the West Country, encoding a local timing judgment in a date that could not be forgotten because the religious calendar was something everyone already carried in their heads. These were not arbitrary practices attached to religious festivals for sentimental reasons. They were observations about what worked in particular landscapes under conditions that reliably arrived around those dates, stored in a form that required no literacy and no calendar beyond the one that already organized daily life. What old British gardeners understood, and what every one of these proverbs encoded, was that growing things is an act of reading conditions rather than following instructions. The conditions are in the soil, in the weeds, in the blossom on the hawthorn, in the elm leaf as it opens in spring, in the behavior of the plants already growing around you. Gardeners who could read those conditions consistently outgrew the ones who followed printed schedules, because the printed schedules were written for average conditions across the country, and no individual garden has ever been average. These methods were not recorded because the people who used them did not think they needed recording. They were obvious in the way that anything becomes invisible once enough people know it and take it for granted. The generation that held this knowledge learned it by watching, confirmed it by what grew and what failed, and passed it along the same way, through demonstration rather than instruction, in gardens and on allotments rather than in classrooms or books. By the time synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides arrived in force through the 1950s, that generation was old, and the one that followed was told it could buy what it needed rather than learn what its grandparents had always known. Most of what was lost was not wrong. It was simply inconvenient for anyone trying to sell a product to replace it. The weeds in your garden are still reading your soil. The hawthorn is still signaling the season. Rusty nails will still leach iron into the watering can. Potato water still carries what it always carried, and none of this requires a purchase. None of it has stopped working. If you found something worth using in this video, share it with someone who still has ground to grow on, and subscribe if you have not already, so we can keep bringing back the knowledge that the gardening industry would rather you forgot.